Good afternoon. My name is Silvia Tomaskova, and I am the Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at the UBC Okanagan campus. It is my great honor and privilege to welcome you all to this very important event. Before I start, I would like to do a land acknowledgement. And for this particular event, a land acknowledgement seems particularly pertinent and important. I would like to respectfully acknowledge the Syilx Okanagan Nation and their peoples, in whose traditional, ancestral, unceded territory UBC Okanagan is situated. I would also like to acknowledge that you are joining us today from many places, near and far, and I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners and caretakers of those lands. Thank you. Before we start the whole event, I would like to thank the sponsor of this event and donor and introduce the person after whom this event is named, namely Dr. Roger Gale. Now living in West Kelowna, Roger Gale holds a PhD in political science from the University of California, Berkeley. And something good must be going on at the University of California at Berkeley, because I too received my degree from that fine institution. In the past, Dr. Gale supported a bursary and scholarship for Irving K. Barber Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences students within the Philosophy, Politics, and Economics program. He also funded a Centennial Scholars Entrance Award for Barber School students, and most recently funded a new Graduate Award for International Leaders of Tomorrow. For today, we are most appreciative of Dr. Gale's initiative to create and provide funding of this community symposium series in PPE. While Roger's previous career involved work in energy and interest in climate change mitigation, in his semi-retirement, he is now more interested in social justice issues and reducing the distance between the university and the community. And I am sure that we all can get behind that. And with that, I would like to welcome the next speaker. Thank you.
My name is Manuela Ungureanu. I teach in the Department of Philosophy, which is a mini department inside the Department of Economics, Philosophy, and Political Science. It probably goes a long way towards what Roger Gale has had in mind already, because the department is encouraging interdisciplinary research as well as interdisciplinary courses. The symposium is supposed to be the premier community event of the same department, in which philosophy just is one tiny little piece. And I happen to work on that little piece together with my colleagues in economics and in political science, who join me on the committee for the Roger Gale Symposium this year. I wanted to thank the members of the committee and to say it is my pleasure to MC the event as the chair of the committee on which they served. I had colleagues from economics, from political science, and my colleague philosopher, who have helped me since September figure out exactly how are we going to put together an event dedicated to an event which is ongoing and which is a war. We started in September and we aimed at a few speakers, again, interdisciplinary, because of Roger's vision of having an interdisciplinary event or interdisciplinary perspectives on a very difficult question. The Roger Gale Symposium has dealt with very difficult questions since 2018. I think it dealt with nuclear North Korea in 2018. After that, it worked on the future of work, but looking at the relation between machines and availability of work. And just a year ago, it tackled the sustainability issue, a really, really difficult tension between individual freedoms and climate change. The keynote speaker at that time was Michael Ignatieff. So that already caused a problem for us. We could not invite Michael Ignatieff to speak again on the lessons from Ukraine this year. So we had to start from scratch, and we had to start with questions that were evolving since September as the war in Ukraine was evolving in Europe and all over the world. So the committee has helped, I think, and I want to express my gratitude for guiding me through this very difficult process. I had a few questions in mind at the beginning because I wanted it to provide education, but as I mentioned at 1 o'clock, not to give reassurance that we know everything we need to know in order to solve the problem of an unsolvable event. I think it is still unsolvable. So we started from this idea that it will have to be with somebody in political philosophy, somebody working in international law, and historians. With historians, we worked very closely. One of them is Norman Naimark. He's generously waiting for me to finish the presentation of this conceptual exercise that we engaged in. So the historians will begin, and Norman Naimark is the exemplary historian of Eastern Europe. I also wanted to emphasize that the conflict in Ukraine is not just a conflict between Ukraine and Russia. It involves a wider global space, well, European space, but it also involves a wider, temporally speaking, global history. So I thought Norman Naimark was the ideal historian for introducing in the keynote lecture, introducing the history of Eastern Europe broadly and the history of the conflict more narrowly. We do have another historian who will be contributing tonight at the event, because after the keynote speech, which is 3:30 more or less until 5 o'clock, we're moving closer to 5:30 for refreshments, but 6:30 p.m. at the Innovation Center with the second historian, Serhiy Kelchik, who comes from University of Victoria, Barbara J. Falk, who comes from the Royal Military College of Canada, and whom have I forgotten? And Norman Naimark, who comes again. Yes, he will join us again. Very generous on Norma's side. The moderator for tonight's event is Adam Jones, my colleague from political science. Tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, we reconvene here with a second panel. Marco Sassoli is an expert in international humanitarian law, and he will be presenting part of the report that he co-authored last April when he visited Ukraine a month and a half after the war started. After Marco Sassoli, we'll have the presentation by Stephen Turner on political philosophy. What can liberal democracies offer when it comes to principles conducting foreign policy? And the third speaker will join us on Zoom from University of Toronto, Seva Gunitsky, on the imperial tendency of Russia's and Soviet Union's foreign policy. The event is a bit overwhelming, just as the war in Ukraine is more than a bit overwhelming, but I was thinking that maybe we'll provide some clarification of questions you might have, or some education on what is at stake, maybe in Europe and in the world, in 22, 23, and I don't know for how long this will last. The questions that we thought in the committee would be most interesting. As citizens of liberal democracies, I thought it is incumbent on us to assess what liberal democracies, governments have done and how they have responded to the war in Ukraine. Barbara Falk tonight will illustrate this question for the case of the Canadian Armed Forces. What has Canada initiated as a response when it comes to the military intervention through NATO in Eastern Europe? But it's not just about liberal democracies, so national states, governments kind of level, and how do they think of their political principles informing their responses, or more than responses, I think, challenges to the war in Russia in Ukraine by Russia. I thought going above the nation state level is what we also need to address. International organizations. One of them is NATO, and Canada is a member of NATO. That's why Barbara's presentation is so timely. But there are other international organizations which somehow match the principles of liberal democracies, but I think expand them. United Nations, the European Union, the Organizations for the Security and Cooperation in Europe, G7, G20, you name it. International organizations provide a legal framework and precedent on the basis of which I think liberal democracies can intervene in 2023 in a completely different setting than you might have wanted them to intervene and to be active in 1945. Two more questions. How do these events challenge the assumptions about international politics after the Cold War when dealing with authoritarian regimes or dictatorships, and in particular, warmongering dictatorships? And the last one, if we can foresee, or if the experts can help us foresee, what are the political and economic implications as the boundaries of the old international order are redrawn? The questions are maybe too systematic, maybe too political scientific, or sort of lecture hall oriented, but I wanted to give you a sense of what guided our invitations, our extending invitations to the speakers, and how we wanted to follow Roger's ideas that whatever responses, theoretically speaking, we are addressing, they should be coming from a variety of theoretical perspectives, including political philosophy, but not restricted to it. About Norman Naimark now. The webpage for Norman is much longer than I was able to print on one, but I'm going to tell you what struck me. And if you don't know anything about me, you certainly know that my name is Eastern European. So everybody who teaches Eastern European studies is going to find a place in my heart. Naimark presently holds the Robert and Florence MacDonald Chair in Eastern European History at Stanford University. It's not just Soviet history, it's not just Russian history, it's Eastern European history. He's the senior fellow of the Hoover Institution and the Institute of International Studies, where he was the convener of the European Forum. Remarkably, Norman has been the editor of a variety of leading journals in the field. I'm going to begin with the American Historical Review, the Journal of Modern European History, and then my favorite ones, Eastern European Politics and Societies, and Kritika, which is a journal focused on reinterpreting Russian and Soviet history so that we understand the broader context of the other Eastern European settings. He served as and chaired the major professional committees that foster research and exchanges with the successor states of the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. He has been on the board and then president between 97 and 98 of the American Association for the Advancement of Slavic Studies. What interests me the most, though, are the titles of Norman's books. In 1995, he published a book called The Russians in Germany, a comparative study of ethnic cleansing and genocide in 20th century Europe, was published in 2001 at Harvard. It's entitled Fires of Hatred. Then he has been working on two projects, of which I think one is now in paperback, not just hard copy. It's a book on Stalin in Europe, 1945-1953. That's how it's advertised on the webpage. But now I've got the real title, and I think the title is very telling. It was published in 2019 in hard copy, and the title is Stalin and the Fate of Europe, the Post-War Struggle for Sovereignty. He published that in 2019 at Harvard University Press. The struggle for sovereignty in Eastern Europe continues, and it continues, unfortunately, with a war. I'm pretty sure Norman Naimark will explain a little bit about that very difficult, painful, traumatic set of events, which started with the Holodomor, which is where his presentation will begin. Please welcome Norman Naimark.
Thanks again for the invitation. I'm sorry I can't be there in person, and I'm sorry I can't see your faces. So this is, I've done lecturing on Zoom before, but usually, you see all those little faces in those little boxes. So it's going to be a little awkward, but, we'll do this. The title of my talk today is The Holodomor and Russian Atrocities in Putin's War on Ukraine. And I'll try to keep to my time and watch my time so that I don't go too far over. Last Friday marked 1 year since the horrible war in Ukraine began. I confess that I was one of those who was naive enough to believe that the Russians would not attack, despite the warnings from US intelligence, which were made obvious about Russian troop concentrations on the Ukrainian border. From my perspective then, and I continue to maintain now, this war is absolutely not in the interests of the Kremlin or even of Vladimir Putin. It's proven a catastrophe for Russia. First of all, in terms of the numbers of casualties, which may have reached, by many estimates, 200,000. There's the severe damage to the economy, which is in part related to sanctions, but more to loss of markets and the cutting off of crucial imports. Moreover, 500,000 young Russians have fled abroad, many of them crucial to the economy. There's the exposure of Russian military weakness and the inability to accomplish what they said they were going to accomplish. And then there's the utter destruction of Russia's relationship to the Western world, which is going to have effects for decades, if not more, to come. Now, of course, the war has exacted an immense toll on Ukraine as well. The casualties are harder to calculate, and some people say in the neighborhood of 60,000 dead, wounded, and missing, though again, no firm numbers have been released by the Ukrainians. There's the senseless bombing of civilian homes and infrastructure, which destroys not only people's domiciles, but also creates, as you well know probably, enormous pain and suffering, anxiety as well. There are the millions who have sought safety abroad, now estimated around 8 million, including about 2 million in Russia itself. Then there are 5 million displaced at home. You know, we can use numbers like that and throw them around, but it doesn't, these stories, as you probably know, can be extraordinarily difficult and involve great hardship. There's the damage to the Ukrainian economy, which may be functioning at roughly a third, to a half of capacity, according to various estimates. And then there are the atrocities of various sorts that have been wrought on the Ukrainians in the occupied territories. And we'll speak of those in a little bit later. But whereas Ukraine has been spiritually and morally enriched by the unity and sense of purpose that the war has engendered, the Russians struggle to create reasons for this war beyond the kind of cynical attempt to seize territory that was not theirs to claim in the first place. In other words, the Ukrainians really have gotten something out of this year of war. I don't think the Russians have gotten anything, to tell you the truth. Now, these months, December, January, February of this year and last, also mark the 90th anniversary of the height of the killer famine that constituted the 1932-33 Holodomor, translated literally death by hunger. If we take ourselves back to this day in 1933, to Ukraine and Ukrainian lands in the Kuban, which was a large fertile territory of some 40 million people, the area resembled, in the words of my inimitable words of my former colleague, Robert Conquest, now deceased, It resembled, in quotes, one vast balsam, unquote. And I'm quoting again, a quarter of the rural population, men, women, and children, lay dead and dying. The rest in various stages of debilitation with no strength to bury their families or their neighbors, unquote. The horrors of the Holodomor cannot be underestimated. There was cannibalism and necrophagy, rampant. Even many of those who survived suffered permanent damage, physical and or psychological. The best estimates now that there were about 4 million excess deaths in Ukraine as a result of this 1932-33 hunger. This was more than decimation. Every 8th person in Ukraine succumbed to the famine in 1932 between 1932 and 1934. We should note that there are Ukrainian scholars in Ukraine who suggest that the number of victims is much higher. There's been an estimate of some 10.5 million, but I tend to think that the work of the University of North Carolina Chapel Hill demographer, Oleg Volovina, that this work more or less stands up to scrutiny, and he comes up to with the 4 million figure, although we'll never know exactly how many died. Now, when I think about the topic of my talk today, it seeks to link the Holodomor with contemporary events in Ukraine. 4 basic observations come to mind. First of all, the history and memory of the Holodomor in Ukraine is essential to understanding contemporary events in Ukraine. You know, the past teaches us about the present. We all know that. But the present also teaches us about the past and helps us understand it better. It's a kind of conversation. History is a conversation between present and past. There have been great leaps in our understanding of the Holodomor, especially since the beginning of the century and the Orange Revolution, 2004-5, and then Euromaidan in 2013-14. It has become apparent that what transpired was not just an attack on the Ukrainian peasantry by the Soviet state, seeking to break its back in a series of disastrous requisition campaigns, but that this attack was genocide. In 2006, the Ukrainian parliament passed a resolution recognizing the Holodomor as an act of genocide against Ukrainians and even making Holodomor denial illegal. The 1932-33 events constitute an attempt to eliminate all or part of a national group, that is Ukrainians, as such. To paraphrase the 1948 UN Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide. In this genocidal attack, the Moscow government assaulted not just the peasantry, but also the Ukrainian intelligentsia, which lost close to 200,000 members, and really the flower of the Ukrainian intellectual elite. It attacked the Ukrainian church and Ukrainian priests, killing many tens of thousands, and attacked educated Ukrainians as a whole, including, by the way, Ukrainian party members who were purged and frequently killed or exiled in the 1930s. It's important to note that such an assault on a nation of such magnitude inevitably causes serious intergenerational trauma in the development of a people. From numerous psychological studies of children, grandchildren, and even great-grandchildren of victims of the Holocaust, and even, by the way, of offspring of the Armenian genocide, which was, after all, a very long time ago, 1915-16, we know that the intergenerational trauma of genocide continues to affect people in powerful ways. engaging with the history of genocide, discussing its implications in the media, schools, public forums, museums, inside academia and out, is all part of the process of healing, which can take and is taking a very long time. This crucial process is well on its way now in Ukraine, especially after Maidan in 2013-14, and all it meant to the development of Ukrainian historical consciousness. Since February 24th, 2021, the trauma of the Holodomor has been compounded by yet another overt genocidal attack on Ukrainian national existence, the unprovoked invasion by the armed forces of the Russian Federation. We do not know how this war and the repressions in the occupied territories will end. Unlike the history of the Holodomor, its history is impossible to write. But we do know that much the same kind that this kind of elimination violence, eliminationist violence traumatizes large segments of the population that have to endure firsthand killings, beatings, torture, and a variety of war crimes and crimes against humanity. One sees, by the way, and you must see this too in your students at your university, that Ukrainian students themselves are in some senses traumatized by what they have seen and what they have heard happening to their fellow countrymen and women. In both cases, the Holodomor and the Russian attack on Ukraine today, we're dealing with a double threat to Ukrainian existence. First of all, there is the threat to Ukrainians' physical existence. Now, in the case of the Holodomor, this was through starvation, deportation to the Gulag, and outright execution by the authorities, all of which eliminated, as I said, 4 million Ukrainians and maybe more in the rest of that decade. In the case of Ukraine today, there's the bombing of apartment buildings, the deprivation associated with the targeting of infrastructure, and the repressions by the Russian occupation authorities. And again, Ukrainians themselves are very aware of what's going on, and this serves as an attack on them as well. Those who have not perhaps experienced it themselves. And then there's this ominous threat of genocide, which is a particularly vicious attack on the people's identity and sense of belonging to a related group, because it means the elimination of that group. Stalin and Putin belong to the same category in this sense of Russian enemy, attacking the physical existence of Ukrainians, but also their very idea of self, the self as belonging to a nation and an ethnic group. Now, of course, an amazing result of this two-pronged attack on the lives and identity of Ukrainians is that Ukrainians have stood strong against the invasion and against Moscow's fallacious historical arguments about their nation that are attended to it. I'm sure you know about the July 2021 Putin document, which basically says Ukrainians don't deserve to exist as a separate nation. They aren't a separate nation, Putin says. Moreover, the Holodomor teaches an ambiguous lesson that the Russian leadership, of course, in the case of the Holodomor, the Soviet leadership, is perfectly capable of trying to eliminate Ukrainian identity and distinctiveness. There are, of course, many reasons Ukrainians are fighting so hard and have unified behind their government and their president to resist Russian aggression. But it surely seems that one of them, subconsciously or consciously, is that they know from the history of the Holodomor that their very existence is in jeopardy. Alas, the Russian occupation of Bucha, Izium, Mariupol, and other towns and villages, where multiple Ukrainian and international organizations are documenting the intensity and extent of Russian violence, are only reinforcing that understanding. In other words, the Holodomor and the contemporary atrocities are really reinforcing each other in Ukrainian consciousness. Now, while we're on such a grim subject, it's worth noting that the effects of such genocidal attacks by Moscow on Ukrainian identity and nationality are compounded by the entire history of violence in Ukraine in the 20th century. The Lviv historian Yaroslav Hrytsak estimates that if one adds the victims of the two world wars to those of the repressions, collectivization, famine in the years 1921 to 23, and again 1932-33, then between 1914 and 1915 in Ukraine, every second man and every fourth woman died. Every second man and every fourth woman died. This is a breathtakingly painful statistic, which only compounds the tragedy that has now enveloped Ukraine in this frightful war. Now, the second observation, general observation I would make linking the Holodomor to the genocidal war in Ukraine now is the extent, not just of violence in general, but specifically of terror and torture, which, it's worth noting, are common to the history of genocide everywhere. Now, there's several aspects of this observation. First of all, there's the readiness of the Soviet and now Russian perpetrators to terrorize the Ukrainian population and to use torture in the Holodomor to extract grain from peasants in 1932-33. There were also these confessions that they were trying to extract from Ukrainians then, and even now, of anti-Moscow activities. These alleged enemies then are pervasive, and therefore, torture is used, to extract the confessions that the Ukrainians are guilty of these crimes. One can easily hypothesize strong continuities between the OGPU and the NKVD, the secret police torturers of the 1930s, and those now. The FSB, which is the heir of the KGB, for the most part, is in charge of occupied Ukraine today. And it has more similarities, actually, to the NKVD than to the KGB, which was somehow more refined and more civilized than either the NKVD or the FSB in Ukraine today. These continuities and connections grow stronger as the war goes on. It's becoming more, in other words, of a secret police state occupied Ukraine than it was at the outset. This has been effectively argued, in my view, by a Russian investigative journalist and expert on the FSB, Andrei Soldatov, who's written numbers of articles about this sense of continuity between the NKVD and the FSB today. I suggest to you a couple of books. First of all, there's Lynn Viola's fine book on Stalin's perpetrators on trial, about the NKVD perpetrators in Ukraine in the 1930s. And the second book I would recommend is Stanislav Asiev's The Torture Camp, which is a gripping memoir of his treatment as a Ukrainian journalist reporting on the Russian occupation of the Donbass. From them, From these books, one can only conclude that very little has changed in the methods and brutality involved in the torture. The electric shock treatments, the beatings, wanton beatings, the violation of the human body in the most inhumane ways, the various forms of what we would now call waterboarding, and the perfunctory and non-judicial murders. I mean, again, read those two books about the NKVD in the 1930s in Ukraine and the FSB in occupied Donbass, today, and you can't really see the differences between the treatments of the victims. Asseev's observation that the torturers are frequently sadists and misanthropes also has considerable validity and is backed up again by Lynn Viola's book, as well as his assertion that torturers only get more brutal as time goes on. In other words, these investigations, these interrogations, and these brutal tortures are continuing and multiplying in the occupied territories. There is no pity and no empathy for the Ukrainian victims. This goes from the torturers, most of whose names we do not know, to the very top of the political structures involved. And this, of course, is Joseph Stalin and Vladimir Putin. In fact, one of the saddest observations I would make about my own work on comparative genocide is that gratuitous violence of the sort that Ukrainians were subjected to in the Holodomor and are subjected to in the occupied zones today remain at the heart of the genocidal enterprise. On one level, of course, the violence is strategic, meaning built into the planning of the perpetrators, in this case, the Russians. On another level, it is completely unnecessary in accomplishing the ends of war or occupation, or even in the early 1930s of grain requisitioning. There were all kinds of ways to get it without the kind of brutal treatment of the peasants that they were subjected to by NKVD and other Soviet officials. Today, there's the heart-stopping inspection of documents, the terrifying invasion of domiciles, the violence of the arrests, the brutal confinement to dark basements, preceding torture and sometimes death. And this happened as well during the Holodomor. Ukrainians were sent off then in bitter and sometimes fatal exile in the Gulag during the Holodomor, and before and after, by the way. Now they are removed to dangerous filtration camps and uncertain fates in Russian prisons and work camps in the far reaches of the Russian Federation. These filtration camps, by the way, were originally, these filtration camps are designed after the filtration camps that the NKVD and SMERSH, as it was called, Russian military counterintelligence, was used during the Second World War, where Russians returning and Ukrainians returning from the front or from, prisoner of war status in Germany were put through these camps and, sometimes beaten, sometimes tortured, and then set off to punishment. Many of these filtration camps, I should add, are used, to try to recruit agents who would then be used by the FSB to send back into Ukraine for the purposes, of spying for the Russians. Terror, torture, and genocide are made possible through the processes of dehumanization. Every scholar who works on comparative genocide understands this. A young colleague of mine at Stanford named Rhiannon Nielsen talks in her work about the imputed toxification of fellow human beings. In other words, what she's saying is it's not just about dehumanization, but it's about the creatures who are dehumanized then being able to infect the rest of the body politic. In this case, the alleged enemy, Ukrainians, are not only less human in the Holodomor, taking various animal and insect visages, vermin especially, and presently, Ukrainians are put in the category of Nazis, neo-Nazis, with all of the horrible caricatures involved in what it means to be a Nazi. So not only are they dehumanized, but they are infectious and threatening to the health of the Russian body politic. Again, both then and now. In the early 1930s and today, Ukrainians are seen as dangerous through their very existence as a nation to the Russian Federation now and to the Soviet Union then. In the early 1930s, Ukrainians were denounced as Petlerists or Petlerites, deriving from Simon Petler's key role in the period of the Russian Civil War and Ukrainian independence, or the attempts to establish Ukrainian independence during the Civil War. And Petlerists, again, evoke images of a nasty, ugly, dehumanized Ukrainian. The same thing goes now for what are called Banderites, after the Ukrainian nationalist leader Stepan Bandera, who was at one point involved in Nazi planning for Ukraine. I mean, there are lots of arguments about Bandera back and forth, but the point is that all Ukrainians are now Banderites, which means, again, a kind of image of a thieving Nazi, horribly violent opponent. How could Soviet communist idealists, one thinks of the later dissident Lev Kopolyev, do what they did to innocent Ukrainian farmers during the Holodomor and still think of themselves as idealists? Well, part of the answer is their ideology, contributed to the nastiness of their actions. But part of it is clearly the dehumanization of their victims. You could also ask the question, how do young Russian soldiers, from the provinces, 18 years old, 19, recruited into the army, shoot down innocent Ukrainians with, grocery bags on their bicycles in the streets of Bucha and elsewhere? Whole families, how could they just kind of, with those tanks, blow up a car, filled with children and their mother and fathers? Similarly, these dehumanizing images of supposed Nazis that Ukrainians are portrayed as plays a big role in the perpetration of these horrific crimes. But some would suggest that the very lack of a compelling reason for the Russians to be in Ukraine, and we hear this over and over again, from Russian troops who deserted or Russians who were interviewed, sometimes will say, we have no idea why we're here, or no idea why we're going there. That this lack of reason prompts Russian soldiers into a kind of nihilistic brutality. And that's a hard thing to demonstrate and a hard thing to prove, but nevertheless, there's something, I think, to that hypothesis. Terror and torture cannot be understood separately from sexual violence that infuses genocidal situations. On one level, like torture itself, sexual violence, including mass rape, is strategic, meaning it's built into the goals of the perpetrators to terrorize the population. In other words, there's nothing accidental or idiosyncratic about it. On another level, also like torture, it is completely unnecessary in accomplishing the aims of the occupation or the ends of warfare. This kind of violence is part, clearly, of the story of men at war. One could say, especially Russian soldiers at war, which I studied at one point in the 1990s. But it also appears organized, systematic, and seemingly ordered from the top. And we really don't know as much about that as we need to. The readiness of contemporary observers and scholars to talk about sexual violence in the Russian assault on Ukraine today has made it clear how important it is to understanding the genocidal aims of Moscow. I mean, attention to this problem is critical. And people don't like to talk about rape. They don't like to talk about sexual violence, but it's extremely important in understanding the overall goals of the Russian government. It's much more difficult to talk about sexual violence in the history of the Holodomor. Oksana Kish has written movingly about the sacrifices of Ukrainian women during the Holodomor to keep their children alive, including giving themselves sexually to collective farm heads, chief of requisition teams, NKVD bosses, and so on. She also indicates that there's a lot to be learned about sexual violence, a lot more to be learned about sexual violence during the period of the Holodomor. Part of the problem, a big part of the problem, is the meager documentary evidence from that period, in which speaking about rape and sexual violence was, on the whole, a taboo subject. I mean, people just wouldn't speak about it, neither women nor men, victims nor perpetrators. So there's very little evidence that we have that could document this very well. And again, I think this scholar has done a nice job with the subject of mothers doing what they can to save their children. But that's really pretty much all we have. Now, let me move now to the third observation. Remember, there were four altogether. I think I'll get through them, I hope. I'll try to do this one a little more quickly. And this is about the Holodomor and the present atrocities in Ukraine in the way that they are characterized by outright denial. Comparative genocide studies make clear that denial is sort of sewn into the fabric of genocide. It's there from the very beginning. I mean, the moment people do these things, awful things, again, whether it's the Holocaust or Armenian genocide or Stalin and the Holodomor or Hitler and the Jews or Milosevic and the Bosnian Muslims, the moment they start to engage in genocide, they deny that it's happening. Again, perpetrators of atrocities, Ottoman Turks against Armenians, Serbs against Bosnian Muslims, Germans against Jews, or in our discussion today, Soviets and Russians against Ukraine, will deny that it took place, and even that it's going on. At the time of the Holodomor, Stalin not only denied that there was a famine in Ukraine or in the Soviet Union as a whole, but he refused help that was proffered from the West in a variety of forms. I mean, even in the 1921-22 famine, the Soviets were ready to accept aid from the American Relief Association, Herbert Hoover's gang. And we have a big archive on that here at the Hoover Institution. But in 32-33, Stalin just wrote it off. And there were many offers, including from the Vatican, some from the Poles, something from the Romanians, to help. But he said, no, we don't need it. Forget it. There's nothing going on. It's worth adding that many Western observers in the Soviet Union said the same. What famine? This was the attitude of the famous New York Times journalist Walter Duranty, whose columns on the Soviet 1930s earned him a Pulitzer Prize. I mean, I have some colleagues who are on the Pulitzer Committee who are trying to take away that Pulitzer Prize from him, but so far it hasn't worked. Later on, Russian history books. And when I say later on, even after the fall of the Soviet Union, Russian history books, even by reputable Russian scholars of rural Russia, will deny that the Holodomor was genocide. Basically say there was a famine all over the Soviet Union and Ukraine was no exception. To be fair, there's also a form of denial in the West as well, where some historians of the Soviet Union, and these are good historians of the Soviet Union, some are colleagues and friends, will insist there was no special intent, an essential characteristic of genocide, to eliminate Ukrainians in 1932-33. Now, what's so interesting about this is that the present conflict and the obvious attack on Ukrainians and Ukrainian nationality by Putin and the Russians is changing people's minds about what happened in 32-33. So same colleagues who didn't want to talk about genocide before this war are now talking about it in 32-33. In other words, if Putin and the Russian government can today be seen as trying to eliminate the Ukrainians as a distinct nation, then it's not impossible, to conceive that's what Moscow had in mind in 32-33, and that's what I believe they did have in mind in 32-33. As you know, however, the Putin government denies the whole panoply of atrocities, not to mention genocide, carried out by its forces in Ukraine. Evening television, Russian television talk show programs are about frequently alleged Ukrainian atrocities in the war zones. Not, of course, about the genocidal program of the Russians. I confess I watched these programs with a combination of both fascination and disgust. My wife, who also knows Russian, is in the background. Sometimes she hears what they're saying and she just yells and screams. She can't stand it because they're so transparently lying. And I mean, scholars don't like to use that word, but that's what they do about Ukrainian atrocities against Russians. And denying that there's anything, I mean, they don't even bother to deny that they're doing anything. In other words, everything that's accused, that they're accused of, they then turn back on the Ukrainians. There was one thing, by the way, just last night, I'll just mention it to you, about the use of gas in the war. Chemical agents in the war. I should say chemical agents in the war. Where some people have accused the Russians of perhaps preparing, to use chemical agents in the war in Ukraine. And what they said is that's a cover for them preparing to use it against us. And that's how they work with the atrocities as well. Okay, at this point, let me leave the denial question and turn to the issue of atrocity crimes in Ukraine, the sort of fourth area I want to talk about. I should point out right at the beginning of this discussion that the Holodomor received none of the attention that the crimes in Ukraine today have received. It was certainly talked about in the Ukrainian community almost immediately. I mean, sooner than one might imagine. Ukrainians in Chicago, were talking about what was going on in the family and what had happened to their people in Ukraine. There were some congressional hearings, but those were in the mid-1980s, right? 50 years later. And Robert Conquest was a kind of moving figure in getting those hearings getting those hearings held by the Congress. As far as I know, though, and I'm ready to be corrected, there have been no attempts through international law to hold the Soviet Russian state accountable for the genocide that occurred in Ukraine in 1932-33. In other words, there's been no retrospective acts. There have been no attempts to try in absentia. I mean, I did participate, I have to say, in one German kind of mock trial of Stalin, and there was a mock trial of Stalin and Mao and Hitler and others, but no serious attempt by the courts, to deal with what happened in Ukraine in 32, 33. Now, according to the 1998 Rome Statute, which set up the International Criminal Court, which took up its function in The Hague in 2002, there are 4 major categories of atrocity crimes which the ICC will deal with. And the ICC was set up to deal with these because, these special tribunals in Bosnia and Rwanda and also in Cambodia, were causing all kinds of both budgetary and administrative problems. So the ICC was set up to deal with just what's going on in Ukraine today. These 4 categories are: 1, war crimes; the 2nd, crimes against humanity; the 3rd, wars of aggression or war of aggression; and the 4th, genocide. So let's talk about each of these sets of crimes. War crimes. At last count, the Prosecutor General of Ukraine, Andriy Kostin, stated that the authorities have registered more than 65,000 Russian war crimes since the conflict began last year. I mean, the Prosecutor General's office has been very busy, documenting these war crimes. I mean, it's a really important part of Ukraine's appeal to the rest of the world for help. Here, we're talking mostly about causing bodily harm and using torture, but also about, and I'm quoting now, extensive destruction and appropriation of property not justified by military necessity and carried out unlawfully and wantonly. End of quote. Now, if nothing else, the Russians are certainly doing that in Ukraine. I mean, this destruction of apartment buildings, the bombing and the use of drones, to destroy people's homes and their domiciles, where families live, and killing men, women, children, old people, bombing hospitals, bombing maternity wards, bombing schools. I mean, you can't chalk that up to a mistake. You simply have to say they're bombing everything, and this is a wanton destruction. So, this category, war crime, fits to a T, what I just read you. Other prominent war crimes in Ukraine include the, in quotes, taking of hostages, which they do, and in quotes, the transfer, directly or indirectly by the occupying power, of parts of its own civilian population into the territory it occupies, which of course it's doing. It's transferred people into Donbass, right? Within and outside its territory. Or the deportation or transfer of all or parts of the population of the occupied territory within or outside this territory. So they're taking the population within Donbass and transferring that. That's also a war crime. And they've done this. We've seen it. Now you see it on the television news in Mariupol and Kherson. All these people, carrying all those bags, getting onto boats to cross the river from Kherson into Russian territory. Some are clearly going on their own, of their own volition, but many are forced to go. And that is a war crime. My understanding is that no more than a handful of Russian soldiers so far have been indicted and put on trial for war crimes. But already this is happening, and already there's a record, and these judicial records are going to be extremely important to historians, just as the judicial records of the ICTY, the court in Yugoslavia, and the ICTR in Rwanda are, trying to reconstruct what happened in Bosnia and what happened in Rwanda. The second category of crimes are crimes against humanity. The second category of atrocity crimes are crimes against humanity. Kamala Harris, you may know, the Vice President of the United States, made a speech at the Munich Security Conference February 19th saying, the United States government, and I won't read you the whole quote, but the United States government has collected information, meaning the State Department, by the way, which has a big section collecting information on atrocity crimes in Ukraine. They've taken that information and measured it, she said, against legal standards. And we are convinced that there's no doubt, she says, no doubt, that crimes of humanity have been committed. It's worth registering that not just Ukrainians are making sure that these crimes are documented, but so are foreign governments and the United Nations, and especially the United States government and European Union. So there's a whole panoply of people who are collecting this information, believing that it's important, to document in terms of getting your history of the war straight, but also bringing people to justice. Whether that serves as any break on Putin, we can discuss in question and answer time if you feel like it. Now, there's a considerable overlap between war crimes and crimes against humanity. The emphasis of the former is clearly on the action of soldiers and armies, and the latter on civilian authorities. It's a little hard to know where to put, as I mentioned, the FSB is basically running Donbass. Are they civilian authorities? Yeah, they're probably mostly civilian authorities. But at the same time, they're part of a military operation. This special operation that Putin has launched, and not a war. There's like I said, there's considerable overlap between war crimes and crimes against humanity. The crimes against humanity include things like murder, extermination, enslavement, and the deportation and forcible transfer of population again. So, what happens in these towns, Mariupol and Kherson and others in terms of forced deportation, that can be a war crime or a crime against humanity, depending on its particular context. Now, the third category of atrocity crimes is war of aggression. The ICC has ruled that it cannot prosecute the Russians for this obvious crime. Again, it's as obvious as some of the other things we've been talking about, right? It's a war of aggression. The Russians attacked Ukraine, which was in some senses a completely innocent. It was not ready for war. It did not expect war itself. I mean, the Ukrainians were saying the same thing I said at the time. And my friends in Ukraine said, no, there won't be any war. So it was a completely unexpected, unprovoked, unnecessary attack. Ukraine has asked, and by the way, they can't do this because the ICC can't prosecute the Russians for a war of aggression because of a ruling, I think it was 2008, which said because Russia was not party to the ICC agreement and is a state, not an individual, they can't be prosecuted because they have to be part of the agreement as a state, and they're not. So what's happened as a result is that the Ukrainian government has appealed to the United Nations to set up a special tribunal to try the Russians for war of aggression against Ukraine. This is and the UN itself is considering it. I mean, I signed a petition maybe 10 days ago that was put together by a couple of ex-American ambassadors to Ukraine, urging Secretary of State Blinken to put pressure on the UN to set up this tribunal. In other words, it would be up to the UN. And it's in part because the Russian invasion is a blatant violation of Article 2.4 of the UN Charter, which provides that states are not allowed to use force in their international relations. They're not allowed to use force, except in the case of self-defense and a few other cases that don't apply. I mean, the Russians are going to say this, and do say that they're defending themselves by attacking Ukraine. But of course, that's absurd in any kind of realistic evaluation of the situation. We'll see what happens. It's interesting to register the fact, by the way, that the Germans, Nazis, were put on trial at Nuremberg in 1946 primarily for the crime of the war of aggression, of aggressive war against their neighbors. Unprovoked, unnecessary, unjustifiable war against their neighbors. And the Nazis were hanged, right? Many of them were hanged for having carried out that war. It is certainly the crime by Putin and his associates that's most flagrant in some sense in the case of Ukraine. I mean, just again, a flagrant violation of international law and all the international order stands for. Then finally, there's the category of genocide, which is, according to some jurists and historians and other scholars, the crime of crimes. According to others, it's not. It's on the same magnitude as the other crimes. In other words, the genocide is like and equal to crimes against humanity, war crimes, and the crime of aggression. Both Volodymyr Zelensky and Joe Biden have called the Russian actions in Ukraine genocide. And there's much to speak for that. Article 2 of the Genocide Convention enumerates several acts committed with the intention to destroy. Now I'm sort of quoting, it committed with the intention to destroy in whole or in part a national, they use this awful word, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. End of quote. Now, among these various acts are killing members of the group, meaning you evaluate this today, killing Ukrainians, which they are certainly doing, and killing them as Ukrainians, which they are also certainly doing. Causing serious, and I'm quoting again, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. I mean, there's no question that they're doing that. Deliberately, and I'm quoting again, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. Well, there, by the destruction of infrastructure, by the, destroying people's ability to heat their homes or to feed themselves or to get, fresh water or to, take care of their various medical needs, they're in some ways inflicting harm on the group as a whole. And finally, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. Now, I know in Canada, you're thinking about this issue, this forcible transfer of children, in conjunction with the genocide or whatever it might be called of the First Peoples in Canada. But here, this transferring of children, the Russians are clearly doing. And there are a series of reports that have come out. The most recent one stating that some 6,000 children, many of them orphans, have been removed from Ukraine to a network of adoption and re-education facilities. There are 11 such camps, most located over 500 miles from the Ukrainian border. So far, and I'm not sure how they managed to document this, there are 350 forced adoptions have taken place, and 1,000 more are in the planning stages. And that's one of these acts, that contributes then to the understanding that maybe what's going on in Ukraine is genocide. All of these crimes in some fashion have happened in Ukraine. Certainly, this makes the actions of the Russians in Ukraine genocidal. And I use that word to mean like genocide. But there is not yet the kind of courtroom proof that these actions were intentional and deliberate, which would then make it easier to call this act, in other words, genocide. But let me just say, it doesn't bother me that Biden and Zelensky says, yes, it's genocide, or that some Ukrainians, many Ukrainians, say it's genocide. Let's hope that judicial tribunals will be able to turn their attention to this matter sooner rather than later. Now, I want to try to end on something positive. That's the end of my 4 observations. And that's the importance that Ukrainians and Western analysts have attached to getting the message about atrocities out there to the international community. I'm impressed that Ukrainian scholars, activists, government officials today are collecting materials on the Russian occupation, documenting the atrocities in detail. They've taken this up from the very beginning, just as the deniers deny from the very beginning, almost for the first time in the history of genocide, those who it's being committed against are documenting its perpetration. They understand the inherent importance of the war as fundamentally existential for the Ukrainian people. I'm convinced there'll be a museum one day that documents the atrocities committed by the Russian occupiers and the Ukrainian victory against what seems like overwhelming odds. There is a museum of the Holodomor. I worked on its board, and it's quite impressive. So we'll see a museum of this occupation, just as we have seen a museum of the Holodomor. Scholars will argue, and argue a lot, about what the narratives should be and how it should be set up. Politicians will have their ideas of what should go into it and how the narrative should be structured. I've worked on enough historical museums to know they don't happen fast, but they do finally take place. The Holocaust Museum was conceived in 1978 and was opened in 1993. And those arguments, remember, were about the Holocaust that took place in World War II. The museum dedicated to forced deportation in Berlin, which I also worked on for over a dozen years, was long in coming. It was conceived in 2000, funded in 2008, and opened in 2021. I mean, just to show you how difficult and hard it is. These things take time, but this kind of work is crucial to building the kind of historiography and document base that will enrich these efforts.
The question I have is partly, are you familiar with the work of Anne Applebaum, if I pronounce your name right, about Stalin times and Stalin crimes?
Yes.
And have you ever worked in Russian archives, if I may ask you about that? And if you can elaborate, maybe if you have time, about what can, how could you connect to the government of your country to educate people about what happened, so people in different countries could support Ukraine better? Thank you.
Okay, thank you for the questions. I'm glad I understood clearly. So we made contact, which is good. Yes, I know Anne Applebaum. I know her well, actually, and I have read her stuff, and I continue to read her things about various issues in The Atlantic, where she has a regular column, and a very good one. I mean, I think she's doing great work, and I actually write her every once in a while a fan letter when I read something that I think is really well done. So she's reliable and she's great, and she has good feeling for Ukraine. You may know her husband is former Polish foreign minister. She knows the region. I don't know if she knows how well she knows Ukrainian, but she certainly knows Polish, and she's comfortable where she is and in her judgments. Yes, I've used the Soviet archives since I was, I would say, a kid, meaning a young assistant professor First time I went to the Soviet Union was 1969-70, and it was a long time ago, to work. And in 1975, I had the longest stint there, about 7 months in the archives, and I've been going ever since. And to tell you the truth, it hurts not to be able to go. I mean, in the sense that I have friends there. My friends there, by the way, the people I know, hate the war. I mean, no one should imagine that, the propaganda works on everybody. The problem is it works on most people. But it's very hard, when you're used to seeing your friends, and these are very close friends and colleagues. And also, Russian archives, people have told me these days are easy to get into. There's nobody there. There's not much business. So it's hard not to be able to go to Russia. But, it's also dangerous, I think, for Americans. And we saw that with Brittany Griner. Anyway, I've used the archives a lot, and I really enjoy working there. We, by the way, here at the Hoover Institution have major collections that were either copied or filmed in one way or another from the Soviet archives. So, for example, we have almost the entire Gulag archive here. So if you want to write a book about the Gulag, you don't have to go to Russia. You can just go to the Hoover Institution archive, and it's got a tremendous amount of stuff. So, not all of the Russian archives are just in Russian. Sometimes it's easier, just to go across the street here to the Hoover archive and work there. You're absolutely right about this, about the importance of education and getting the word out, both about Holodomor and about the contemporary atrocities. In the case of the Holodomor, there's a quite wonderful organization. I'm on the board, I guess I would say, but it's still a wonderful organization in Toronto called the Holodomor Research and Education Consortium. And they're doing the best they can. And they're doing a good job, I think, of getting the word out about Holodomor. It's less difficult, I think, in Canada, where there is a large Ukrainian community and people, think about Ukrainian history probably more than they do in the United States, where we have a lot of competing interests. But still, I think people are doing a good job with the Holodomor, and on the whole, a lot more is being written. There's a lot of good stuff. I just was a jury member of a competition about the best work in Holodomor studies. And I must say, I read a whole bunch of stuff I hadn't read before, plus some stuff I'd read before. And it was really good stuff. So there are a lot of good young people working in this field and people trying to get the word out about Holodomor. In terms of contemporary atrocities, I think, here governments are directly getting involved. I mean, the U.S. government has been very active. And again, the Vice President of the United States spoke about it. President of the United States spoke about it. There are many senators and Congress people who are talking about the atrocities in Ukraine, the need to help Ukraine. And I think this is also true in England, France, Germany, and Western Europe. I mean, less so in China, obviously, and then India and Latin America, but I think the word is getting out and should get out. And I hope, by the way, let me just conclude this part of your question with this part of my answer by saying, I hope this thing works with the UN Tribunal on Russians in the war of aggression. They need to be called to account by the international community. They are in some ways through sanctions. I mean, the sanctions are important, and they're working unevenly, but they're important. And they need to be called to account in front of the international justice system. And, they'll complain it's just winner's justice, or it's just, our side's justice. It's just the West's justice. But nevertheless, it's important, to do these things and to get them right. Thank you for the questions.
Thank you very much. My name is Jeff Sigalet. I'm an assistant professor of political science here at UBCO. I have zero expertise in this area, and I'm very grateful to you for your talk today. It was very compelling. I think I see Stephen Kotkin's biography of Stalin behind you. And that was my vacation reading. My wife told me I was crazy when I was reading it on summer vacation this year. And I really thought it was a fantastic biography. And if I'm wrong, one of the thrusts of the biography is that Stalin, after the initial phase of Stalin's career, where he goes along with the sort of semi-capitalist kulak toleration policies, he then switches to full collectivization and convinces, it's not, there's this characterization, this view of Stalin as this bully who is anti-intellectual. And I think Stalin, what I got out of the biography partly is that Stalin convinced a lot of communists that collectivization and his brutal version of it was the true vision of communism, was the true something that they actually believed in, because he convinced many of them that. And I've heard Kotkin speak, and he said one of the things, someone asked him in the audience, what do you take away from your career? And he said in like a one-liner saying that lots of communists actually believe in communism. And I'm paraphrasing there, not saying it as well as he did. But my question when you're speaking was, one of the things in my mind was, to what extent is Putin analogous to Stalin in that regard? In the same, he's not a communist anymore, maybe, but there's a new ideology at play in Putin's Russia. And so to what extent is he analogous to Stalin in the sense of convincing his fellow Russian elites that this war is in the interests of Russia, and that Russian expansionism is, to what extent, what is he convincing them about? What is this ideology that he's convincing them of? I mean, is it just a new nationalism? Or is he also convincing them that this is actually genuinely in Russia's national security interests, or is it both?
Okay, it's a great question. And the answer is complicated, right? I also know Kotkin. He's here now at Stanford. He moved from Princeton to the Hoover Institution, and he's here full time. And I would have gone to his talk this morning, except I had to work on mine. He gave a talk this morning about this, and we're friends. So I agree with this. I agree with the way you started. In other words, that Stalin had an enormous ability, a great ability. I mean, you may even know it in your political science department or in my history department, of convincing others that he was right. He also had a way of diminishing people, which hopefully doesn't happen in your political science department or my history department, diminishing people with whom he disagreed. He could be very cutting, and he could be very mean in these small meetings of the Soviet leadership. And this is at the beginning of the 30s, when he's already beginning to seize control. I mean, by 30, 31, Stalin's really in control. And if somebody crosses him, it's difficult, right? And you have a similar phenomenon, I think, with Putin. I think he's very convincing. I've actually heard Putin speak, and he can do things I think Stalin couldn't do, which is, for example, talk, without notes, without anything in front of him, for several hours with an audience asking questions. And he can talk extemporaneously extremely well. And he's a smart man. He's sharp, and he is convincing. So I think that, that part of your question makes a lot of sense. That both, in fact, I'll just tell you, I'm on something on Friday, if you're at all interested. It's at 9:30 in the morning here, so it'd be 9:30 in the morning with you, at the Harvard Davis Center. It's the anniversary of Stalin's death. And he died in 1953, March 5th. And, so we're talking about, I have a talk that I've got to finish preparing about Stalin and Putin. So you jumped right into that, which is good, because it makes me think too. The point is this business of a convincing presence. But the convincing presence in both cases is backed by a certainty of power, or not complete power, but a kind of ability, in other words, to manipulate the environment in a particular kind of way, and to manipulate people in a particular. I wouldn't underestimate the manipulative part of both Stalin and Putin and their ability, to make friends and that kind of thing. Now, and I think there are a lot of analogies. So with both of them, I think ideology is important. But I've also argued in my last book and would continue to argue that ideology has a kind of, and I don't know if this makes any sense to you at all, a kind of really realist core. In other words, you can be ideological, but the sense of that ideology in the end is a kind of hyper-realism, of the sort, what's that guy at Chicago's name, who does international relations and is considered the super realist. Anyway, it doesn't matter. There's a kind of super realism involved, which is the height of communism. In other words, you don't do things that will get you in trouble just because of the ideology. You're going to do things that make you successful, and that makes you the best communist. So I agree about Stalin's communist core, but the communist core also is infused by what I would consider a kind of hyper-realism. I mean, he knows what he's doing, and he knows why he's doing it, and he thinks it's going to succeed. And the same thing with Putin. He's a realist, and he screwed up in Ukraine, and now he doesn't know how to get out of it. In other words, what he did is he made a decision, based on information. People say he didn't get good information, he got bad information. I think that's garbage. I think he gets all the information, just like Stalin, got all the information he needed. He made the decision based on that information, some of which was probably fallacious. All information, is mixed, fallacious, and good. So how do you unscramble it? He made the decision to invade, which was a cockamamie decision. He screwed up. He thought he would remove Zelensky in no time at all, and that Kiev would be his, and he put in a puppet, and that would be it. It didn't happen that way, and he got caught. But I still think of him as a realist. And that's my only hope, by the way, for getting out of this war, is that eventually that realism is going to sink in and say, he's got to do something, to concede to the Ukrainians something that will make them ready then to get out of the war as well. And finally, what kind of ideology does Putin have? Now, Stalin is clearly a Marxist-Leninist Stalinist / also nationalist. And Putin has got this really mixed bag ideology. And some people have suggested it's, he's influenced by Eurasianism. Well, I think there's something there, but I wouldn't go too far with that. I heard a paper the other day here, not the other day, 3 weeks ago, talking about the importance of Third Rome, the church, and his kind of coming to orthodoxy, right? Well, I'm not so sure about. I mean, that's there too, but I'm not sure that's it. I think you said it right at some point, which is that he's a great power chauvinist, and he wants Russia to return to the international stage as a great power. And the only way, or one of the ways, an important way, maybe even a crucial way to do that for Russia is this linkage with Ukraine. In other words, that linkage between Ukraine and Russia, was at the core of the power of the Russian Empire, which lasted from, the big Russian Empire active in Europe was from Peter the Great, to 1917. But really from Catherine, who seized big parts of Ukraine until 1917. It was also at the core of the Soviet Union. What made the Soviet Union powerful was the fact that Russia was linked with Ukraine. And so he sees that. He sees, well, we need them linked up with us again. We need them in our camp. And if they're in our camp, then we're powerful again. We're not just a minor power. We're not just a minor, country on the landscape. We're really up there. And so that, I think, this kind of great power chauvinism, and then there are other things as well. I mean, there's this sense, I won't go through all of this, but there's this sense that I get very powerfully from Russian television. That may not be the best source, but also from Putin's speeches, of a feeling of insult. Ukrainians, are our little brothers, and look what they did. They turned away from us. Now, initially, they said it was just the elite, that turned away. And then eventually they started talking about Ukrainians generally turned away from. In any case, they feel insulted. We're good guys. We're the good guys. We've taken care of you all these years. We've given you protection. We've even built industries and cities, which they're now destroying. I mean, it's hard to imagine, but a city like Kharkiv, a city like Dnipro or Dnipropetrovsk, as it was, were built together by Russians, rebuilt after the Second World War by Russians and Ukrainians together. These cities were burned and bombed and destroyed in the Second World War, and it was a tremendous effort to rebuild them, again, both by Russians and Ukrainians. And they feel insulted that the Ukrainians say, we want to go elsewhere. We don't want you anymore. We want to be part of the West, nuts to you, in your autocracy. We want to be Democrats. We are Democrats, and we don't live well with you. So goodbye. And there's a kind of, it's, I don't know how you put that, how you would categorize this in the ideological terms, but it's part of this mindset, that makes them willing to fight on and to think that they can win this war. So let me leave it at that.
Why is that Putin wants to dominate Ukraine, given the potential consequences given by the UN and NATO for their crimes against humanity? It's the first question. And the second,
why does Putin want to do what to Ukraine?
Genocide with Ukraine potentially cause Putin to be motivated to dominate Ukraine.
Okay, so once again, let me repeat what I said before, is that from the Russian point of view, from Putin's point of view, he's not committing crimes against humanity. He's not committing war crimes, and he's not committing genocide. So from their point of view, all of these crimes are turned back on the Ukrainians. Now, the Ukrainians are doing what Russians have been accused of doing from the Russian point of view. Putin, there are several parts of the story, but one part of the story, again, is he wants to dominate Ukraine because he sees it as dangerous to him. I mean, he doesn't want a democratic, Western-oriented country like Ukraine, which has been partners with Russia all these years, maybe unwilling partners, but still in the same country all these years. He doesn't want to see that now as a kind of Western country on his borders. Part of it is fear of NATO and, American troops and that kind of thing, but I think that's the least part. I think the biggest part is he is an autocrat. He is an autocrat. And he doesn't want, this big, important example of democratic, capitalist, free market, European cultural and civilization on his Western border. And so he is ready then, for some of the reasons I also mentioned already, to take this step. UN, what does that mean? And NATO, well, NATO's more serious than the UN, right? NATO could do things to him. But he understands that if he stays within certain limits, NATO will not get directly involved. Just as NATO understands, that it stays within certain limits. We're not flying sorties over, Moscow or Tobolsk. I mean, we're not going to do that. So NATO understands that it's got limits. And one of the limits is it can't put troops on the ground. And the other limit, there are advisors and things like that, but it can't put real fighting troops on the ground. Another limit is, you don't want to get involved with nuclear weapons. And both sides understand that limit. So there's a kind of dance going on. A dance of each side recognizing their limits and each side having their goals. And to tell you the truth, atrocity crimes don't figure very much in Putin's calculations. He doesn't think he's ever going to stand trial, or the Russians are ever going to have to, in some senses, pay, for their crimes.
I thank you so much for your talk. I was struck by your description of the agents of these atrocities, and you talked about nihilistic brutality. So I'm wondering about, this is in a sense an unanswerable question, but the people on the ground carrying out these atrocities, and I think back to literature on comparative genocide, the Christopher Browning book, and this idea that there's an ideological explanation of dehumanizing the enemy, but there's also situational explanations, whether it's, they thought they were going on training somewhere in Russia, they end up being shot at in Ukraine, or they're not being fed, or they're being commanded badly, or whatever it is. So I'm wondering if you could comment briefly on kind of how you understand what's going on the ground with these agents of atrocity. And also, of course, the very complicated problem that Ukrainians and Russians, there's a lot of intermarriage. Some of the people being killed in Ukraine are, of course, ethnic Russians, or have Russian backgrounds, right, or part of the Russian world. So it's a very complicated, hard question to get at, isn't it? Kind of what's driving these people on the ground?
No, that's right. I think that's accurate, and I think the complexity, if not overwhelming, is definitely there, and it's important. And this is why I say it's hard. It's hard for me. I mean, everybody has their own way of probably stating this, and I've sort of decided on my way, at least for the present, that I can't call it genocide as such, but genocidal. It's like, so many parts of it are like genocide because we don't know a lot. We don't really know much about Putin either, for that matter. What he's saying to people, what he's ordering, what he's not ordering. We don't know how the FSB. I mean, again, I had conversations with this guy, Andrei Soldatov, I was talking about. There's so much we don't know about FSB. He knows everything there is to know, and there's still so much that we don't know. And so we don't know who's giving directions and who's giving orders and how those orders are being carried out, and what is prompting, these soldiers, to engage in these terrible atrocities. And so I think it's a mix in the context. I think you said it, or at least I will rephrase what you said to say what I think, which is that the context frequently, dictates what happens. In the context, you're right. Sometimes they're mad, they're hungry, they thought they came someplace where they were going to liberate people, and the people didn't act like they were liberated at all. In fact, were angry at them, and that they were getting shot at once in a while. I tend to think of that as a little bit of an excuse, but sometimes it clearly does happen that they're getting shot at by civilians, with muskets and things like that. So that it's just a mixed bag. It's a mixed bag. Motivation, psychological, ideological. There's also, I said this in my talk, and as I said, I worked on the Russian army during the Second World War, and what happened when they invaded Germany, and came to the conclusion then that there's something not quite right about Russians at war. They win the wars frequently. They won the Second World War. They were brave. They were courageous. They fought against all odds, the backs against the wall, and they managed to turn around the German armies and push them back to Berlin. They took Berlin, and, fierce, awful fighting at the end of the war, right? This was January, February 1945. But they also, I'm convinced, are not trained properly, to think about how to deal with civilians. They're not inculcated with values about the human quality of the people they're fighting against. Now, you can say the same thing, of course, about American troops who are fighting Vietnamese, and American troops in the Second World War when we were fighting against Japanese, and had all kinds of terrible stereotypes and dehumanization stuff. But these days, in the modern armies, people are trained, on how to deal with civilians and not to take your wrath out on them. It's a very important part of it. It doesn't work all the time. We have our Lieutenant Callies, of course, but I've come to the conclusion that Russians are not trained that way. The Russian soldiers are not trained that way. And when you get these raw recruits, they've raised several 100,000, 300,000 troops. They bring them from the countryside. They're boys. They train them how to shoot and how to survive a little bit for a month or so, 6 weeks, and then they send them to the front lines. And it's just assumed they'll be good Russian patriots. And then you also have, of course, the Wagner Group, which is made up of convicts and stuff like that. But I wouldn't just blame it on the convicts. I mean, I think that there's a problem also with the officer corps and how they communicate with their men and the hazing that takes place in the Russian army. So it's partly Russian soldiers at war. And there were atrocities like this in Afghanistan. There were atrocities like this in Chechnya, some terrible, terrible atrocities in those two Chechen wars. And so, there's something else going on there too, not just ideology, not just the psychological situation, not just the immediate context, but also what happens in terms of their training and how they think about the enemy. They themselves, I saw these interviews, I'll just conclude with this. I saw interviews with a bunch of these kids. In the early days of the war, the Ukrainians captured them, interviewed them. They don't do that anymore. I don't know why. But so I listened to these interviews with these kids from the provinces, and literally kids. I have a 19-year-old son. They were his, they were his age. Oh man, they didn't know where they were. They didn't know what they were doing. They had no expectations about that they would lose, that they would get hurt. It was that kind of thing. So they were innocent kids, nice kids, but put in that situation without the kind of, orders and training that you need to respect civilians, and not knowing really why they're there, except for some vague Russian patriotism, I think helps create the situation in which they commit atrocities. Sorry, that's a long-winded answer, but it's a good question.
All right, we have to conclude our session here. So thank you so much, Norman, for being with us today and for your, I don't know if you can see me. So let's give a round of applause to Norman for his keynote presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I did hear the round of applause. Thank you very much.